Hello and welcome to the Weekly Takeaway, what you need to know from the news. Some stories we'll consider this week. The DoD travel ban to remain in place forever or until Tuesday, whichever comes first. In other news, they'll be home by Christmas unless they're not. We'll talk about the fight for religious liberty around the world, and we will see finally a faithful life on display. Our first story today, the DoD travel ban to remain in place forever or until next Tuesday, depending on which happens first. The Stars and Stripes has a great article that sums up this story for us so well. And the reason I'm sharing this story, there's only one reason, because as someone who is in the military, to me, this story sums up military life. Now, if you didn't serve in the military, I don't know what you think military life is like. Maybe it's about patriotism. The American flag is always waving in the background. When I think of military service, there are some great things that happen, but the day-to-day is this right here. Here's the title of the article found in Stars and Stripes. Pentagon, stop movement order to remain in effect unless local conditions at bases meet criteria for travel. I'll read you a little bit of this. A memorandum issued by Defense Secretary Mark Esper, dated May 22nd, states he has canceled the prior travel guidance that went into effect April 20th, which was expected to end June 30th. He extended the travel restrictions for all government travel of personnel and their families indefinitely, unless locations meet specific criteria to allow travel to resume. This is the most military story you will ever hear. Here's how it goes. Let's make it as clear as possible. The travel restrictions that were put in place a month ago, we rescinded that order. And then we put it in place again indefinitely, so if there's no ending, unless some things change, in which case it will end. If that's not confusing, then nothing is confusing. Now, as someone who works for an organization that supports the military, this has caused mass chaos, as you can probably imagine. Planning events, planning movements, families trying to plan travel. All they know right now is that the restrictions on travel will extend forever unless things change. And that sums up military service. We're thankful for all those who serve in the military, of course, and thankful for the great things they do in defense of our country. But the day-to-day living under the umbrella of the Department of Defense can be a confusing life. We need to pray for those who are pushing through these restrictions. Our next story, also coming from the Pentagon, is found in a Military Times article entitled "Pentagon to Present Afghanistan Timelines to Trump, including one for withdrawal by Election Day." This, of course, is an article that discusses the United States military withdrawing from Afghanistan. And in the age-old tradition of hoping we'll be home by Christmas, we have about that much clarity in this story. I'll read a little bit of this to you. Pentagon spokesman Jonathan Hoffman declined to discuss specific meetings with the president, but said on Tuesday that any reduction under the agreed-upon 8,600 troop number will be conditions-based. He added, however, that the recent ceasefire over the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr and the Afghan government's release of 900 Taliban as part of a prisoner swap were incredibly encouraging. This article goes on, and again, you can find this in the Military Times, to explain that there are a number of possibilities being put forward to the president to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan, hopefully by the end of the year, preferably before the election, but possibly as far out as May of 2021. There is so much discussion to be had around this, of course, and I would imagine this timeline will change. But for me, there's a major takeaway. As someone who served in the military, who was in Iraq in 2003, who's watched this unfold for 20 years, there is a major takeaway, and one that we have to look at and remember the next time we decide it's a good idea to go into another country. I believe that the considered cost of war must include the difficulty of leaving a nation once that nation is conquered. Now, I know there are those who would push back on the idea that we have conquered Afghanistan. Certainly, we have not conquered. We have occupied, we have defeated an enemy, we have struggled to maintain control, but here we are. And 20 years later, we're still trying to figure out how to get out of the country. We had a goal going in, that was to remove the person we felt was responsible for the bombings of the World Trade Center on 9/11. We know all of this, we've talked about all of this, this is historical record. But now, again, for 20 years we've been trying to figure out how to get out. The cost of war is high. The cost of war is financial. It is the cost of lives going forward to do the things that we need to do in a wartime scenario. But that cost is extended over generations when we talk about the difficulty of removing ourselves from a country once we've gone in. There is a takeaway, and the takeaway is that we must consider every cost before making the move like the one we made going into Afghanistan. These next three stories all fall under the same heading: the fight for religious freedom around the world. I think we all understand that there is a fight for religious freedom taking place around the world. Sometimes as Americans, though, we forget the high cost of that fight. Again, these three stories help to illustrate this. I want to start with this story found on cbnnews.com. It's entitled, "California Ends Ban on In-Person Services with Restrictions." Now, in California, as in most states in the country, there was a moment in time, and this is changing across the country, but there was a moment where in-person services were restricted. They weren't allowed because of the coronavirus and all of the things that we've been talking about over the last several weeks. Governor Newsom, the governor of the state of California, the state in which I live, came out this week and said that the restrictions on in-person services in the state of California will be lifted to some extent. There still are restrictions, and there are a lot of things that churches must do in order to have in-person services, but we're starting to make a move toward pre-coronavirus service schedules, and we're all thankful for that. Many people in our country have been screaming about the violation of religious liberties in the United States under the guise of safety. I've talked about it even on this show. That's one story. There's a second story that I want to bring to your attention, also on cbnnews.com. The title of this article: Senators Ernst and Grassley ask Trump to deploy special envoy to Nigeria to end Christian genocide. Now, I'm building somewhere. Think about the first story. We, because of the coronavirus, because of all of the health concerns and the safety issues that we've been discussing over the last really couple of months, paused in-person church services. We're getting those back. We're thankful for that. We have, as Americans, considered some of that to be religious persecution. Now, we can make an argument for and against. That's up to you to decide. But this next story speaks of Christian genocide. Christian genocide. So bad, in fact, that two senators here in the United States have asked for a special envoy to go to Nigeria to intervene. In their letter, the senators point to 40,000 Nigerian deaths tied to the Islamic terrorist group Boko Haram. I could continue to read. This is not a news story. It's probably not a news story to you, although in the midst of everything else happening in the world, it falls under the radar. In Nigeria, one country in Africa, Boko Haram, we know a Muslim militant group, is responsible for 40,000 Nigerian deaths. And this goes on day after day after day after day. There's another story found in the Christian Post. It's entitled this: Zoom evangelism meeting raided by police in China. Wuhan pastor interrogated after Zoom evangelism event. He said this: "I will only live for Christ." Now, get the picture here. In Wuhan, China, so much has happened there. This has been discussed ad nauseum since it started. We believe this is kind of ground zero for the coronavirus. Everything there was locked down. A pastor was meeting with his church over Zoom. You know Zoom because all of us are using Zoom now. Our entire lives are run by Zoom meeting now. We're more familiar with Zoom than any of us ever thought we would be. A pastor is holding a service via Zoom, this private internet situation that apparently is being spied on by the Chinese government, and he was arrested and interrogated for holding a service virtually on the internet. His statement is a great statement. He said, "I will only live for Christ." I want us to take all three of these stories and consider kind of the bigger picture. Here in the United States, we have these events take place and we scream about religious persecution. And yet in other places, in countries in Africa, 40,000 and many more than that, Christians are being killed. We see in places like China real persecution taking place, where even a pastor who's meeting with his church on the internet via Zoom is arrested and interrogated for sharing his faith, not in the public square, but on a private Zoom link. I believe we sometimes forget the high cost of religious freedom around the world. There is a takeaway here. As with so many freedoms, we must never forget the high price of our freedom to worship. We take for granted the opportunities that we have, while Christians around the world are risking everything to worship. Coming back to our California story, I don't personally believe that what we've experienced through this coronavirus as churches has been religious persecution. Perhaps in some corners, perhaps to a small degree in some places, but not overall. I think governors and other administrators of states and local municipalities are trying to figure out the best way to manage a health crisis, and churches have gotten caught up in that. But as men and women of faith stand up and say we need to preserve our right to gather as Christians, some would say this is extreme. You need to just be careful or be quiet and go along with what the government has to say. It bears being said that we should not give up our rights as Christians in a free country to worship. Because the other side of this, the far extreme of this, is real religious persecution. When we consider religious persecution and we consider what it costs to be a Christian in so many places, we need to see the whole picture. And we need to understand that if we forget what it really costs, then the freedom that we have, just like so many other freedoms, to worship the way that we believe is right, will slowly fade away. Don't ever forget the high cost of your freedom to worship. Our final story today is really the reflection of a life of faithfulness. This week, the memorial service for Ravi Zacharias will be held. Ravi Zacharias, if you're not familiar with him, was an evangelist. He spoke around the world about matters of faith, and really what he was the most well known for was his ability to defend the gospel. He was a master of apologetics. He died on May 19th of cancer. There's a great story in the Christian Post about his upcoming memorial service that sums up a part of his life. Ravi Zacharias, this article says, spent the past 48 years traveling the world to commend the Christian faith and address life's greatest existential questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny with eloquence and grace for a variety of audiences. It goes on and talks about all of the things that he did and the tremendous impact that he had in so many areas in this matter of faith. He influenced Christians, he influenced laymen, he influenced those in the public media and those in private conversations. A man of faith. I bring this up to bring us to our final takeaway for today. Even in a world that is so upside down, there are pilgrims worth following if only we will look. There are, even though it doesn't always feel like it, men and women who are faithfully serving while leaving a legacy that matters. And Ravi Zacharias was one of those men. We were privileged as a world to have his example of faithfulness. May we continue to follow it, even though he has now gone on. And these are your stories from the week. I hope that these are an encouragement to you, and I would encourage you, once again, get beneath the headlines. See the stories as they really are. Determine what's true and what's not, and determine for yourself the takeaway for your life. Hope you have a great weekend.